My name is Gabriel Sanchez. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science here at the University of New Mexico. I'm also a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C., and run UNM Center for Social Policy. Well, one of the first things to point out is, although, and I've listened to hours and hours of focus groups already this election cycle, once you get into a conversation with voters about climate change, they have tons of ideas. They recognize it's incredibly important. Typically in surveys, when we ask people what's the most important issue that you care about or that'll be driving how you vote, climate change doesn't really surface even for most voters, even in the top 10 of issues. So it's an important thing that we think about, not necessarily being on the front of the minds of voters, but once they get into a conversation, they recognize this is incredibly important. Subtopics within that vary depending on which candidate we're talking about and how they frame the issue. For Democrats, President Biden, Vice President Harris, I think will lead with a lot of the accomplishments that they've had in their administration, which has really been trying to make climate change a big picture issue in their overall administration. They've probably done more in that area than any other administration in American history. So they're going to try to point out to voters, here's what's already working, here's what we've already done on this issue. That plays incredibly well, particularly to young voters. Republicans, on the other end of it, are going to be framing this really on the context of jobs and the economy. And they're going to say things like, hey, we don't need this right now. It's going to lead to less jobs. We know, particularly in the state of New Mexico, oil and gas jobs are a big deal. So they're going to try to frame this in the context of moving away from that means it's bad for the economy, means it's bad for American jobs. And I have a feeling that's how this is really going to be presented to voters as we get closer to the election in November. Well, one of the things that I love about climate change as an overall policy issue is it's one of the areas where you can see really clear distinctions between both parties and both presidential candidates. Essentially, they're like night and day different in terms of not only their policy views, but their track records on the issue of climate change. So here in New Mexico, voters will have a very clear distinction on which of those two approaches they prefer. And I think for New Mexicans, they're going to be used to the Democratic side of that narrative, primarily because our governor has been very aggressive in moving our state away from fossil fuels and having what is often referred to as a just transition to clean energy. So here in New Mexico, folks that like what we're seeing in the state are probably going to like what the Democrats are essentially selling when it comes to climate change policy. Flip side of that, however, is Republicans and moderates that might not actually like what they're seeing in New Mexico might prefer sticking to fossil fuels, which has obviously been a main driver to the state's economy here in New Mexico for some time. So I think that's really the nuance to this conversation in New Mexico, is really the underlying economic issues that obviously are highly correlated with what direction we go into, clean energy or remaining with fossil fuels. You know, the oil and gas industry has always been one of the most successful and powerful lobbying entities in the state of New Mexico. So a lot of voters might not even recognize that a lot of what we see in terms of campaigns, a lot of outcomes at the state legislative level are influenced a lot by the oil and gas industry, who obviously have a lot of financial incentive to try to push for policies that they perceive are good for their industry. So I think that's one of the backdrops that we think about here in New Mexico. And one subgroup of the electorate that I think climate change is particularly important to are young voters. And when I say young voters, I mean voters under the age of 30. In poll after poll, whether it's in New Mexico or nationally, I consistently see that climate change is much more important to that segment of the population. And so having the presidential candidates and candidates here in New Mexico talk about that issue, regardless of what side of the aisle they're on, is good for one important factor: enthusiasm and potential turnout of young voters, which obviously is a big deal when we just think about democracy and how we engage young people into civics in this country.